maybe two introductory points. This did sort of start out in my mind as an appraisal of APRAP, but it really turned out to be an appraisal of some of the interpretations that people put on APRAP. APRAP, I think, for the most part, provides a kind of neutral, factual, statistical description of the Adirondacks. There's not a lot to assess. I mean, I didn't find any mistakes in it. On the other hand, it has been spun in a lot of different directions. And I think what's interesting is to find the right button. Well, this says next page. All right. Really to figure out what you make of the kind of numbers and descriptions of the Adirondack communities that they give. Here's some of the things that, the second introductory point I was going to make is about the book. They make great Christmas presents and I'm retired, so the Adirondacks is a tough place to make a living.
Request just to be a little bit louder.
Oh, bellow up?
Thank you.
All right. These are some of the things from the executive summary. That the park population is old and getting older. The regional economy is highly dependent on correctional services, and the population is got lots of inmates. They aren't around Old Forge, except every now and then you see them with a shovel out doing something useful. That school enrollments are dramatically declining, and a very high percentage of the park is either publicly owned or in conservation easements. Are these true? Sort of. By 2020, will the Adirondack region be the oldest region in the United States? Depends on what you mean by a region. Come back to that in a moment. Are we terribly dependent on prisoners? Well, in the north we are. Statistically, the number of prisoners makes almost no difference in the average age. I actually calculated that, although I didn't bring it along. School enrollments are plummeting, and I think that's an interesting and important factor I'll talk about down the road. 76%, well, in fact, less than half of the park is owned outright by the state. The other 25% is in conservation easements, so it's working forest. Lumping them together that's a correct number, but it does give you an impression of that the state land dominates the park. It takes land out of production, which is overstated. Interpretations. One of the spins that's been put on it is that the economy of the park is abysmal, and it's all the park's fault. The abysmal economy is attributable to the excessive public ownership and regulation of land. The other one is the economy's great. Adirondack Council put out a letter about this, and the park is the key to the Adirondack success. Which of these is true? I think actually neither of them. One thing I would suggest is that you avoid that debate. That's an old debate, it's an Adirondack debate, it's a counterproductive debate, and its main harm, I think, is that it tends to get Adirondack people to focus on things that aren't as important as actually some of the things that I think they should focus on. I'm going to suggest that, in fact, the truth of the matter is that that while the Adirondack economy is not great, it's not bad, but more interestingly, it's very similar to the economies in other remote and rural areas with similar characteristics. And in fact, the Adirondacks are probably, on average, better off than similar remote and rural communities, and that's probably attributable to the park. But I think the main thing is that if you're going to know what to do for economic development, picking sides in this debate doesn't help you very much. Figuring out what's actually going on is and how to bend it your direction is what you really need to think about. And I think looking at some of the data about how the Adirondacks compares to other regions is helpful in figuring out at least some of the questions you need to ask. So this is a comparative analysis of what, well, how do the Adirondacks compare to other similar communities and with similar economic and demographic characteristics. What accounts for the characteristics of its demography and economy? Is the park an asset or a liability? And what are the trends we really need to worry about? Oops, there's another one down there. And what do we need to know in order to create healthy communities in the kinds of parkland places where we live? There's not two methodologies, there's only one, but it took two slides, so A and B. How are you going to do this? I spent some time trying to figure out what I meant by similar communities. What makes a community comparable. It should be rural, remote, mostly northern forest, although you'll see one exception to that. And it should be sparsely populated. There shouldn't be any local population centers in it or nearby it. So I have not, in fact, when I look at the Adirondacks, I have not looked at the areas around local Lake George because they're too commutable to other places, and you don't get a good perspective of the effects of remoteness, forested land, sparsity when you look at the parts of the Adirondacks along the south and near the Thruway and near Albany. And I've looked for similar communities that are sparse and relatively remote, don't have any, the census has some technical terms for this, but I haven't had a memory for 2 or 3 years now, so I've forgotten what they are. Micro something or other, but it basically means there's no community of more than 10,000 in them, and they're not commutable from some place that has a community like that. There's no substantial public ownership of land, except for working forest, national forest. A couple of the places I picked, including Delaware County, have some public ownership of land. Most of them have some public ownership of land, but it's not dominant in the region. And I've selected areas outside of New York, a couple of counties from northern Minnesota. If you know where the Boundary Waters is, the two counties to the west from the Boundary Waters. The Boundary Waters is itself part of Duluth County, and you can't study it as a county for these purposes. And of course it has a lot of public land, so I picked the two counties going west. Northern Maine, 3 northernmost counties of Maine. If you look at them through Google Earth, tons of trees. And eastern Montana. I picked eastern Montana in part because of my comment about what do you mean by region? Are we the oldest region? You will see the demographics of much of the upper Midwest, in fact, in rural communities. They're lots older than the Adirondacks, and they're aging much more rapidly. If you want a candidate for a place that's aging more rapidly than Florida, go west, not south. I've also selected areas in New York that were, those counties, incidentally, the ones I mentioned before, I tried to pick counties that were contiguous. I did not do that in New York, partly because it's impossible actually to find a lot of contiguous counties that meet those criteria, but also because I wanted a bit of regional spread. Picked Allegheny, Gates, and Delaware. I also looked at towns, compared towns just inside and just outside the blue line. If the park is an asset to the local economy, you would think that Old Forge would be better off than Boonville, just on the other side of the blue line. If the park is a big drag on the economy, Old Forge is about 75% state-owned. If the park is a big drag on the economy, then you would expect Boonville to be doing a lot better than Old Forge. And I also looked at Lowville and Malone. These are, again, small, remote communities, but they're not inside the blue line. And I've compared these various places to what I think of as quintessential Adirondack areas. Essex County, Hamilton County, and Old Forge and the town of Webb. Do you all know where those are? They sort of go from east to west, from Lake Placid over to Old Forge. They're connected, and they are dominated by the tourist industry. They're not especially commutable unless you really like to drive. I mean, I actually, for 7 years, commuted to Syracuse, and I don't really like to drive, but I do like to eat. Not a lot of people who hire university professors in Old Forge, at least to be university professors. And I've compared them on these characteristics. Poverty, medium household income, that's the percentage of families in poverty. Population change from over an 8-year period. Median age and the percentage of population that are 65 older and under 18, so you can begin to get a picture of the characteristics of demographic change. I'm not going to try to, I'll give you about 30 seconds to see if you could absorb these. And then I'll tell you what it says, all right? But these are the Adirondack groups, northern Maine, or excuse me, northern Minnesota, northern Maine, and eastern Montana, and these are statewide figures for the same area. If you eyeball this quickly, I think what you see is that on the whole, the Adirondacks are better off economically on most of these indicators than almost all of these other places. So if you think that these comparative analysis of regions mean anything, they mean that areas with where Parkland helps abet strong tourist-based economies tend to be better off rather than worse off than similar northern forest or, in one case, Great Plains places without these kinds of assets. Same kind of data in New York, that in fact the Adirondack areas tend to be better off than these other rural counties in New York State on these various measures of affluence. These are, of course, not great numbers. I mean, the Old Forge, the Adirondack areas tend to be, for example, for median household income, about 80% of the state average. And that's something that APRAT points out. On the other hand, the cost of living is about 80% of the state average too, and it also turns out that the family size in the Adirondacks is smaller than the state average, so one could argue that in fact per capita we're better off when you factor those other kinds of things in. It's also the case of if you look at New York State data on these things, once you take out if you take out the Long Island and New York City metro areas, most of the state looks like this. That's a bit of an overgeneralization, but Adirondack communities economically are not doing badly in comparison to the rest of the state as a whole once you remove these highly affluent but also very expensive places. Main economic conclusions. The Adirondacks have higher median income, household incomes than comparable rural communities. We have lower poverty rates than comparable rural communities. We also have we have less inequality. I didn't do a table for that, but I think one of the things that I rather like about many Adirondack communities is that the economic range is not that great. In the 2000 census, nobody in Old Forge made more than $200,000. Although there are a couple of people with a much bigger bank accounts. Most of whom, incidentally, are very civic-minded, very much embedded in the community, and really help finance a lot of nice stuff. So we do not have extremes of wealth and poverty in the Adirondacks.